Good day, everyone. This is our group's contrastive analysis final project on translanguaging. We chose English versus Spanish languages for our advanced TESOL final exam course. Allow me the time to introduce my group members. My team, Mr. Alfredo Kukul, Ms. Carissa Ardinet, and myself, Ms. Marissa Baide.
We will be looking at the table of content. We will first begin with the objectives, the student language profile, the student's language analysis. We will elaborate on the background of the school. We will compare and contrast orthography, syntax, grammar, semantics, the morphology, its pragmatics, phonology, phonetics of both English and Spanish. And we will elaborate on the translanguaging strategies as it relates to its phonology, morphology, syntax, grammar, semantics, and pragmatics. And lastly, the recommendation and implication for teachers, how to help learners learn Spanish.
Now we will move on to the objectives for today. Number 1, examining the linguistic background of the Standard 3 students at Hope Creek School, focusing on the native and secondary languages of these students. Number 2 is to explore key languages components and their significance in the classroom. Number 3 is to recommend effective translanguaging strategies in a multilingual classroom. Number 4 is discuss the implications for using translanguaging strategies for Belizean educators, particularly in promoting multilingual and cultural awareness.
On this slide, it shows a visual representation in the form of a pie chart, specifically relating to the ethnic groups of Belize. This pie chart shows that the mestizos takes up the majority in our country at a whopping 54%, followed by the Creoles at 27%, then the Mayas at 12%, and the Garifuna at 7%. There are other ethnic groups in the country of Belize, such as the Mennonites, such as the East Indians, we have the Chinese, etc., but they're not shown on this chart. This slide shows a visual representation of the languages spoken in Belize, with the Spanish language being the majority at 48%, followed by the Creole, which is 34%, Mayan dialects, which are 9%, English at 4%, Garifuna at 4%, and then the 1% goes to the other languages spoken by other ethnic groups in our country. Now let us look at the background of our school that was in focus. The name of the school is Hope Creek Methodist School, and it is situated in a rural area of the Stann Creek District, Belize. It serves a small but diverse community, with the majority of our students coming from a mestizo background. For many of these students, Spanish is their first language and Creole serves as their second language. A minority of students belonging to other ethnic groups have English as their first language. The school values its students' multilingual abilities, embracing a translanguaging approach that leverages their linguistic repertoire to enhance learning. This strategy fosters inclusivity, enabling students to use their home languages alongside English for comprehension and expression. We speak English when we teach at this school, but other languages are encouraged in during instruction time as well to get the message across to students. The focus of this study in a Standard 5 class, which comprises just over 15 students, a very small class, right? Allows for individualized attention and collaborative activities that caters to the linguistic and cultural strengths of our students. By emphasizing translanguaging, the school provides an environment where students' language and cultures are respected and utilize an asset in their education. Okay, this slide now shows our students' language profile. So this is a detailed description of our 15 students that we have in this Standard 5 class at Hope Creek Methodist School and the different languages that they are spoken. If you look at our students, we have a variety of languages spoken in such as Creole, English, and Spanish, right? There isn't any, we do have Garifuna speaking students, Chinese speaking students, and other languages at our school, the Mayas as well. But in this specific class, the majority only speaks Creole, English, and Spanish languages. This slide now shows the Standard 5 students' language profile chart. This one has to do with the student's language profile itself that was previously mentioned on that previous slide. It shows that 40% of our students speak Spanish, while a majority of 60% of these students in Standard 5, which is the majority of students, speaks Creole. So there are only two main languages spoken in this class, which is Spanish and Creole being the main language. Now if we look at the students' language analysis, the Standard 5 class at Hope Creek Methodist School comprises of 15 students, all with diverse linguistic backgrounds. The profile highlights the language distribution among the students, their primary and secondary languages, and the dynamics affecting their multilingual abilities. If we look at the primary languages, there were 6 students who speak Spanish, while 9 students speak Creole. When it comes to the second language, there were 8 students who speak English as their second language, 1 student who speaks Spanish as their second language, and 6 students who spoke Creole as their second language. And then we went as far as third languages. 7 students speak 3 languages, including either English or the Creole language. So that therefore is the dynamic of the students' language analysis from Standard 5 class at Hope Creek Methodist School.
Phonetics. Phonetics refers to the study of physical sound of human speech. Spanish. Spanish-speaking students primarily exhibit Spanish features of the Spanish language, which has more consistent relationship between spelling and pronunciation. For Creole now, Creole-speaking students may have difficulty with the English vowel sound, which do not exist in Creole. English. For English-speaking students, challenges may arise when they encounter songs that are not present in their first language. For example, the consonant blend of the letters S, T, and R, which makes the song stir when blended together, as in street, would be difficult for non-native English speakers. Phonology. Phonology deals with rules governing how songs function in their particular languages. In a school like Hope Creek, which has a lot of multilingual students, they all bring their own distinct phonological system from home. Spanish phonology. Spanish has more predictable stress pattern, where the stress usually falls on the second to last syllables of the word. For example, feliz, which means happy. For Creole phonology, Creole has a more simplified structure, and they usually omit phonology distinction that exists in English. So, for example, the TH song does not exist in the Creole phonology, and that the th song which makes f, the f song does not exist, and it would be substitute for the f song which is f, or the d song which is the. So for example, thing in English, substitute for Creole language would be thing or ding. So English phonology, and the English phonology has complex phonological rules, especially when it comes to the vowel songs and intonation patterns. Now we move on to the recommended translanguaging strategies for phonetics. So, to address phonetic challenges in a multilingual classroom at Hope Creek, the following translanguaging strategies can be used. So, phonetic comparison. Use students' first languages, Spanish and Creole, to highlight phonetic contrast. For example, comparing the Spanish R song with the English R. The second recommended translanguaging strategy of phonetics is for teachers to model this. So teachers can go ahead and model the phonetics song in English while allowing students to do it in their home languages. That will allow them to compare and contrast the phonetic songs in both English and their home language. The third recommended strategy is visual aids. Now, as a teacher, you can provide visual aids of the mouth diagram and even of someone doing or practicing these diagrams on a video, a YouTube video or so. Now, these can help students a lot because they can try to understand this position and the background of the songs, and also try to replicate them in English.
We all know that in our Belizean classrooms, we have students that come from, different ethnic groups, and they have different home languages as well. And so as a teacher, it is very important for us that, we teach students about this morphology, looking at the English and the Spanish languages. So what is morphology? Morphology is the study of the structure formation of words, focusing on how morphemes, which is the smallest units of meaning that is used to combine and create words. In English, articles are simpler with one definite article, the, and two indefinite articles, a and an, which don't change with gender or number. And in Spanish, articles must agree with gender and number of nouns, such as el and la for singular definite forms, and un or una for singular indefinite forms. This contrast highlights the need for learners to pay attention to nouns and agreement rules in Spanish. And as well as when it comes to pluralization, in English, plurals are usually formed by adding s or es to nouns with some irregular forms like child, children. In Spanish, plurals are also created by adding the s or es depending on the word ending, such as gato, gatos, and mujer, mujeres. Recognizing these patterns help learners understand and apply pluralization rules in both languages. Nouns and adjectives do have grammatical gender, but pronouns reflect natural gender such as he, she, and they. In Spanish, nouns and adjectives have grammatical gender, which is the masculine and feminine, and they must agree in gender and number. For example, el perro negro, la mesa negra. This contract means Spanish learners need to focus on noun and adjective agreement rules. And in English, most plurals are formed by adding, which is the ses to nouns with some irregular forms like child, children. In Spanish, plurals are formed by adding the s and es based on the noun endings such as gato, gatos, or mujer, mujeres. And understanding these differences help learners apply the correct pluralization rules in each language. And when it comes to the pronoun, in English, nouns and adjectives have no grammatical gender, but pronouns reflects natural gender. For example, he, she, and they. In Spanish, nouns and adjectives have a grammatical gender requiring agreement between them. For example, el perro negro for masculine and la mesa negra for feminine. And understanding these differences help learners apply gender rules correctly whenever switching between languages. Looking at the recommended translanguaging strategies for morphology. Now, the first one, which highlights cross-linguistic patterns. We can identify similarities and differences in morphological structures between languages. For example, compare pluralization rules in English and Spanish to help students transfer knowledge effectively. And we can also use this translanguaging strategies to leverage cognates, meaning we can use cognates words with similar forms and meaning in both languages to build vocabulary. For instance, we can highlight animal in English and animal in Spanish, to show connection and reinforce learning. And focus on affix usage, meaning that we can teach students how prefixes and suffixes and root words functions in both languages. We can compare affixes like re in English or like redo and Spanish rehacer to demonstrate parallel structures. Another one is we can create bilingual morphological charts. We can develop charts showing how structures in two languages side by side. And these visual aids can help students recognize patterns such as verb conjugations or noun pluralizations in English and Spanish. We can use manipulatives for morphologies, provide hands-on tools like word tiles to help students build and deconstruct words. This approach makes morphological concepts more concrete and engaging, especially for young learners. And teach contextualized morphology. We can introduce morphological concepts within meaningful sentences or stories. This can help students understand how word changes from form depending on their roles in real life contexts. And we can also incorporate students' knowledge of the L1, encourage students to draw on their first language when learning new morphological rules in English. This approach will help build confidence and help bridge, understanding between both languages. And as a teacher, we can design morphological games as well. We can create interactive games where students manipulate words, parts, prefixes, suffixes, and roots in both languages. These games can make learning fun while reinforcing, morphological patterns such as forming plurals or verb conjugations. And lastly, we can encourage reflections of morphological rules. We can ask students to compare and discuss how morphological rules work in their first language, L1, and the target language. And this reflection can help deepen their understanding and recognize pattern across language, enhancing language transfer skills. Teaching students syntax in multilingual classrooms when it comes to both languages or more than two languages, it is very important that students learn syntax. And what is syntax? Syntax refers to the set of rules that determines the structure of a sentence in a language, including word order and arrangement. In a multilingual classrooms, understanding syntax helps students, grasp how different language structures, meaning, and foster better comprehension and comparison. For example, while English strictly follows a subject-verb-object order for clarity, Spanish allows more flexibility for emphasis. This awareness enables learners to navigate and appreciate linguistic diversity, improving their overall language proficiency and communication skills. And understanding as well the subject pronouns rules in different languages help multilingual students see how meaning is conveyed beyond just words. So for example, in English, the subject pronouns are mandatory. For example, I am eating, while in Spanish they can be optional because verb conjugations indicate the subject. For example, estoy comiendo. Teaching these differences in a multilingual classroom enhances students' grammatical awareness, helping them adapt their communication skills across languages and understand cultural nuances. This approach can foster that deeper language proficiency and flexibility in expression. Teaching verb placement in multilingual classrooms helps students understand how sentence structures affect meaning and emphasis across languages. In English, for example, verb follows a fixed order after the subject. For example, he plays football, which simplifies comprehension but limits flexibility. In Spanish, varying verb placement, for example, él juega fútbol or juega fútbol él, can add emphasis or change the tone. Recognizing these differences enhances students' syntactic awareness, enable them to communicate more effectively and appreciate the nuances of different languages. Okay, now looking at the uses of grammar, which is grammar is a set of rules that governs how words are used in a language to form sentences. In a multilingual classrooms, understanding grammatical elements like articles and gender can help students compare and apply rules across languages. For example, in English, articles a, an, and de remain constant, while Spanish articles change to match gender and number. For example, un niño versus una niña. Similarly, while English has no grammatical gender, Spanish requires gender agreement between nouns and adjectives. El profesor versus la profesora. Teaching these differences can enhance students' linguistic awareness, improve accuracy in both languages, and foster a deeper appreciation of language structures and cultural expressions. Looking at the plural formation of grammar, understanding plural formation in a multilingual classrooms helps students grasp how different languages handle number agreement. In English, forming plural is by adding s or es. For example, cats, bosses. While in Spanish, the rules depends on the word ending. For example, pero, peros, luz, luces. Teaching these differences enhances students' ability to apply rules accurately across languages. So these comparisons will foster a deep understanding of grammatical structures, helping students to develop better language skills and adaptability. Recommended translanguaging strategies for syntax and grammar. Now the first one, which is leverage students' native language knowledge. And in this way you can have teachers draw on students' existing knowledge of their native language and explain how grammatical concepts in the target language, for example, comparing how articles functions in Spanish and English, can help students transfer understanding. And we can use bilingual sentence strips. Students match sentences or phrases in two languages, highlighting structural differences and similarities. They can match "she is happy" with "ella está feliz" and discuss word order differences. And we can also use contrastive analysis activities, whereby the students can compare specific grammar rules between languages to identify pattern and differences. For example, students can compare plural forms in English "cats" and Spanish "gatos", noting how endings change. Scaffold with translanguaging dictionaries. Use bilingual dictionaries or create classroom word lists to help students understand and use grammar in context. For example, verb conjugation, like students look up to eat, comer, and see different tenses in both languages. And the other one, which is grammar journals with language comparison. Students maintain journal comparing grammar rules and sentence structures across languages. And they can also, we can also translate and transforms, whereby, students can translate sentences from one language to another and change the structures for practice. For example, translate like I like apples to Spanish. Me gustan las manzanas, then change to I like oranges. And the seventh one, which is visual grammar charts, we can students can create, or we can create charts showing grammar rules side by side for each language to visualize differences. We can also use interactive grammar games. We can use games that involve translating and constructing sentences in multiple languages. For example, bingo with verbs in different tenses matching English and Spanish forms. And the other one, which is we can also use multilingual writing. Encourage students to write bilingual texts. Apply grammar rules for both languages. For example, we can ask students to write story using alternating sentences in English and Spanish. Model translanguaging during instructions, whereby, with teachers switch between languages to explain grammar points and encourage understanding. And the other one is peer collaboration. We can enforce, or we can encourage peer students to explain grammar concept to each other using their languages, their native languages. For example, one student explains subject pronouns in Spanish and the others in English. And we can also encourage multilingual reading, whereby they can use text in both languages to highlight grammar structure in context. For example, reading bilingual storybooks and compare sentence structures. Or they can also, we can also use foster metalinguistic awareness, meaning that we can discuss how grammar works in different languages to build deeper understanding. For example, we can talk about how verb conjugations change meaning in both languages. And last but not the least, we can use the multilingual sentence constructions, whereby students build sentences using words from different languages, focusing on grammar accuracy. For example, they can create sentences like the cat, the gato, which is cat, is feliz, happy, then correct and explain why. So these are the recommended translanguaging strategies for syntax and grammar.
Now let us take a look at semantics as it relates to translanguaging. Semantics is the study of meaning in language. It examines how words, phrases, and sentences convey meaning, including their relationship, interpretations, and nuances in different contexts. Semantics involve understanding literal meanings, figurative expressions, synonyms, antonyms, homonyms, and cultural connotations. As I have mentioned in my definition, semantics is used in many different ways. 1. Understanding meaning across languages. When we look at the denotative meaning, we compare the literal meanings of words in English and Spanish. For example, if we look at the English word book, book is libro in Spanish. But if we look at connotative meanings explore emotional or cultural associations. For example, the word home. When we hear the word home in English, it emphasizes comfort and belonging. While if we hear the word casa, or if we say the word casa in Spanish, casa focuses more on a physical house. 2, we're exploring polysemic and homonyms. So these highlights words with multiple meanings in each language. For example, in English we can say bank. Bank can mean a financial institution, or it can mean the side of the river. So it has more than one meanings, right? Depends on how you use it in context. And then in Spanish, if you say banco, banco refers to the financial institution. While if we want to say if we want to talk about the river bank specifically, it is Orilla del Rio. That more specifies the river bank, right? And 3, idiomatic expressions and figurative languages. So we analyze common idioms, metaphors, and expressions using semantics. For example, in English, we will say it's raining cats and dogs. As an English speaker, I know exactly what it means by saying it's raining cats and dogs. But if we should translate that in Spanish now, if we want to take it literally word by word and translate it into Spanish, we will say está lloviendo a cántaros, which gives it a whole different meaning because the Spanish people will interpret it as saying it's raining jugs. And they won't be able to get the definition or the meaning of that idiom or figurative language out of that literal, taking it literally word for word. So we have to encourage students to find parallels or differences, fostering deeper understanding of cultural perspectives when it comes to the uses of semantics. In continuing with the use of semantics, we can use it for word order and sentence structure. We can discuss with our students how word meaning changes with structure. In English, we usually have our adjectives coming before our nouns. For example, in English, we would say the big red car. Big red is describing what type of car we are seeing, right? But if we should put this in Spanish, we will not put the adjective in front of the noun. We would say el carro rojo grande, the car red big. So as an English speaker who translates things in Spanish, we would usually say that it's kind of back way, right? Another one that we look at is false cognates. This address words that look similar but differ in meaning. For example, in English, when we hear the word embarrassed, we would say that embarrassed is usually associated with a feeling of being ashamed, right? But in Spanish, if we say embarazada, as an English speaker, I would believe that, okay, embarazada would mean the same as embarrassed in English, right? It's a Spanish for embarrassed. But it's not so. So embarazada means Spanish, so I cannot go and say that I am feeling embarazada, taking it into the wrong context, right? Because the Spanish-speaking person will look at me and interpret this word as pregnant and not a feeling of being ashamed. We now look at contextual and pragmatic use of semantics. So we explore how meaning depends on context. For example, in English, you can say, can you pass the salt? Which is a polite request, right? But in Spanish, if you say, ¿puedes pasarme la sal? That's a direct but still positive request as well, right? Now, in looking at our recommendation for translanguaging strategies when using semantics, translanguaging strategies can effectively help our students understand semantic concepts across languages by leveraging their full linguistic repertoire. 1, bilingual vocabulary mapping. We can use that in our classrooms, right? An activity that we can use in addressing this one would be to create bilingual semantic maps to visually connect related words in English and Spanish. For example, map out the word water in English and agua in Spanish, including synonyms. You include synonyms there, right? You know that water is a liquid. The scientific term for water is H2O. When we hear rain, that refers to water coming from the sky. We hear stream, refers to water that flows, right? And translations of these, liquid is translated in Spanish as líquido. Lluvia is translated in English as rain, and then there's rio, which means a stream or river as well, right? The purpose of this will be to help students understand how meanings expand and differ between languages. In continuing with our recommended translanguaging strategies for semantics, we look at translanguaging word walls. In our classroom, we have word walls in English. However, we can use not only English but other languages as well to build our word walls, right? An activity of this would be to build a semantic word wall where students add words, phrases, synonyms, and idioms in both English and Spanish. For example, for happy, we can include contento, alegre, feliz, and their contextual usage. The purpose for building this translanguaging word wall now will be to strengthen cross-linguistic connections and deepen the vocabulary knowledge of our students. Then there's comparative story analysis that we can use as well. An activity that would cater to this would be use stories written in both English and Spanish to identify words with cultural or semantic variations. For example, analyze the word family in an English story and familia in a Spanish text. We can discuss cultural differences in meaning or emphasis. So the purpose of this comparative story analysis will be to highlight how culture influences word connection and context. Then there's cross-linguistic synonym hunt. An activity for this will be to give students a list of words in one language and ask them to find as many synonyms as possible in both languages. For example, for big, the word big in English, big means final, right? Large. So they can go and find the word grande, enorme, gigante in Spanish and explore subtle differences. The purpose of this one now would be to encourage semantics exploration and comparison. Then there's collaborative poster projects now. When we look at the activity in regards to collaborative poster projects, we can assign small groups to create posters that compare the semantic uses of key concepts. For example, when we look at time, home, nature in Spanish and English, they can compare these things, right? They can include the definitions of these terms, the cultural examples of these terms. They can make visual aids when it comes to these, right? The purpose of this now again will be to encourage teamwork. This will foster semantic analysis through creative expressions. We can also look at semantic journals. An activity that would relate to semantic journals would be to have students keep a journal where they record new words, their meanings, synonyms, antonyms, and usage in a sentence for both languages. These are things that we always do when it comes to English, but when it comes to translanguaging, instead of only doing it in English, we can stress the fact that you can also do it in other languages also, because we are trying to create an atmosphere where we allow students to feel included because of the different language that they speak in their homes as their mother tongue. So semantic journals would work here. The purpose of semantic journals would be to help students track and reflect on their growing semantic knowledge. Then there's idiomatic expression comparisons. An activity that goes along with this would be you present idioms in both languages and ask students to compare their meanings and cultural context. For example, in English, a piece of cake. I love cakes. I don't know how you feel about cake, but I love cakes. So in English, we would say a piece of cake. In Spanish now, we cannot say pan comido. So we cannot take it literally, right? Because pan comido means eaten bread. The purpose of this one now would be to deepen understanding of figurative language semantics across cultures. So by practicing all these different strategies, and there are many more, there are a lot more that we can find that can help us when it comes to our classroom in terms of translanguaging strategies for using semantics, right? There are a lot more that we can use, but these are just a few that we're using.
So we move on to pragmatics. And pragmatics is the use of languages as it relates to social context and how it is appropriately used depending on the situation you are in. So we start off with Spanish pragmatics, and Spanish speakers, they use the formal and informal speech from forms to address others based on their age or social context. For example, the word usted is formal, and you can also use the informal, which is tú. So you'll use usted when you're talking to your teacher, but tú when you're talking to a friend. So when it comes to the Creole pragmatic, it is less formal, very less formal in context, and it is less rigid in terms of formality, and it can have influence on Creole speaking students when they're interacting with students and teachers. And as it relates to English pragmatics, students, English-speaking students may be familiar with a more formal approach and standardized language. But they could face challenges when they're trying to navigate between informal speeches. For example, now we'll move on to the recommended translanguaging strategies for pragmatics for the students at Hope Creek. The first one is contextual role-playing. So you're going to engage students in different role-playing activity where they're able to switch different forms from informal to formal speech and from formal speech back to informal speech. This will help them to understand when to use different forms in a speech. So the second one is cultural comparison. Here you want to encourage students to discuss about cultural norms and social expectation across various languages. And for instance, comparing how greeting and politeness and requests are structured in Spanish, Creole, and English. The third recommendation is pragmatic clarification. So you want to use translanguaging to clarify the meaning of idiomatic expression. Polite requests in English by explaining them in both Spanish and Creole. And now we move on to the implications for Belizean educators. Now, the multilingual profile of Hope Creek Methodist School presents a unique opportunity and challenges for educators. Now, by embracing the translanguaging strategies, teachers can help bridge the linguistic gap and help students to navigate between their home languages and English, and fostering deeper understanding of effective communication. So number one is instructional planning. Now, with this, educators will need to incorporate students' linguistic background into their lesson plan and using their home languages to scaffold new concepts and reinforcing learning. Number two is language inclusivity, and teachers must ensure that the classroom environment values and promotes the use for all student languages, creating an atmosphere of respect and inclusion. And number 3, professional development. Of course, educators in Belize should receive training on how to effectively use translanguaging in their classroom. And although it is not given as much, we should and still need to start to demand this as a requirement for teachers, as our country is filled with diverse and multilingual students.
I want to take this time out to thank you for listening to our presentation when it comes to our contrastive analysis of the English and Spanish language in translanguaging. Thank you very much.